the most important tool for pushing back against social authoritarianism or elite hysteria is freedom of speech. Saying the unsayable, rejecting censorship. That is the absolute starting point. I think the death of wokeness has been greatly exaggerated. It's still out there. It is still in the institutions. You have to be the most privileged, ensconced, cosseted to be able to spend your every waking hour talking about an apocalypse, and an apocalypse that's going to come about because of industry or manufacturing, work, transport, all these wonderful developments of modernity, and you see them only as a threat to your incredibly comfortable way of life in the country. It's the ultimate luxury belief. The vibe may be shifting, but one thing that hasn't shifted is the UK government's opposition to free speech. Under the pernicious Online Safety Act, the space for private and open internet use is rapidly narrowing for British citizens. But what if I told you there's an easy, simple way to beat the censors? The good news is that thanks to our partners, Private Internet Access, or PIA for short, you can access tons of content that the government doesn't want you to see. PIA is the VPN I use and trust. In case you don't know, a VPN, or virtual private network, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. Whenever you are browsing online on an unprotected device, your device is transmitting a lot of information out into the open, which can be seen by multiple parties before it reaches the website you're trying to visit. Instead of giving away your personal information and location to the world, PIA lets you change your IP address to one of 91 countries. This means you can gain access to websites and services that are only available in those locations. And it's not just that. Did you know that streaming services like Netflix and Prime Video have huge catalogs of content, but you can only access a fraction of it from your own country? Using PIA to change your location opens up a whole new world of streaming. I love it. Paying for Netflix without using PIA is a bit like paying for front row seats at the cinema but being forced to sit in the hallway. I also use it all the time when I'm traveling to catch up with what's going on at home. And because PIA is available for all platforms, I never need to worry about my safety or my privacy. It works on Windows, Apple Macs, iPhones, Androids, and more. Even better, you only need one subscription to protect yourself across all the devices you own. So, sign up now to the world's most transparent VPN provider and take advantage of our special offer. Viewers of my show can get 86% off a subscription to Private Internet Access. So that's just £1.67 a month. And you also get an extra 4 months thrown in completely for free. To take advantage of this incredible deal, just go to piavpn.com/Brendan. That's piavpn.com/Brendan. Signing up is totally risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. You won't regret it. Sign up now at piavpn.com/Brendan.
Hello, everyone. A natural hush has fallen over the crowd. Thank you all so much for coming to this very special Spike supporters event to celebrate the brilliant new book, Vibe Shift, The Revolt Against Wokeness, Greenism and Technocracy, written by this man right here, Brendan O'Neill. My name's Tom Slater. I'm editor of Spike. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you also for being Spike supporters, for donating to us every month, for making sure that we can produce the magazine, put on events like this. We really wouldn't be here without you. Thank you also to Harry and everyone else at the Tea House Theatre, which on top of being a brilliant venue, a brilliant bar, is also a real champion of freedom of speech, willing to host even miscreants like us. If anyone went to our last event, you'd know how difficult it is for us to find venues. We had to hold it in a second backup place because the first one took against us. So thank you very much to them. And without further ado, would you join me in welcoming the man of the hour, the author of Vibe Shift, Brendan O'Neill. So we're going to have a chat up here for about half an hour or so, and then we'll go straight out to the audience for your questions. So work out what you want to ask. But Brendan, first of all, congratulations on the book.
Thanks, Tom.
Very timely.
Thank you.
And anyone who's read
it was your idea, so we should be thanking Tom.
I bounced him into it. anyone who's read the book or anyone who's read the blurb or anyone who's been paying attention to politics will know that we're in this kind of unique new moment. It feels like your jumping off point for this is very much Trump getting back into office, the sense that wokeness was colliding with public opinion, the sense that Greenism was colliding with public opinion. We've gone from kind of end day stuff to drill baby drill, as well as this new revolt we've seen in the UK with flags going up and hotels outside of protests outside of migrant hotels, I should say. And it just feeling like we're in a very different world. So just to kind of kick us off, because I want to go into the individual chapters and the specific issues that you talk about, but what is the vibe shift and who's been doing the shifting in your view?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? And hopefully I answer it or get somewhere towards answering it in the book. I was thinking about this earlier today. What is the vibe shift? How do we know there's a vibe shift? And I thought, actually, the time I knew was about 5 years ago. This very prim, proper, woke feminist from America came to the UK, and she was really horrified by all the TERFs. She was so disgusted by all these women who were saying, you know, men out of our changing rooms and all that kind of stuff. And she wrote a piece about this, and she wrote about these women who she saw on Hampstead Heath, who were wearing fake beards and mankinis and whatever, and they were jumping into the men's pool and making a show of themselves. And she said, this is outrageous behavior. What are they playing at? And of course, those women were protesting against the fact that on Hampstead Heath, men are now allowed to swim in the women's pond because they can claim to be women and they can jump in and do whatever they want. And she was horrified that women were protesting against this in this kind of very garish, shocking way. And I remember reading that, just feeling so proud to be British, just so full of pride that women in this country are willing to take the piss in such a glorious way out of essentially the woke American empire, which is what this feminist was really representative of. And so it's those kinds of shifts you see in everyday life, everyday society, where you think something's going on, something is happening. Sometimes it's under the surface. It's certainly not covered in the media very much. You won't see it on the BBC News. But for some time, there has been this kind of gathering storm of dissent and just pushback against wokeness, pushback against cancel culture, pushback against absolutely lunatic ideas like the idea that a man can become a woman. Can we just register how insane that idea is? And yet it was orthodoxy for at least 10 years. It's still orthodoxy in some sections of society, but it is being dislodged. So it was things like that. And I just thought, yeah, the vibe is shifting. And in answer to the question, who's shifting it? It's ordinary people. That is the most important thing. I think there is this tendency to credit Donald Trump with the vibe, with shifting the vibe, or the Supreme Court ruling on what is a man, what is a woman, or, you know, BBC Woman's Hour finally giving airtime to a gender critical feminist. Everyone's like, oh yes, thank you BBC for shifting the vibe. No, that's not where it comes from. It comes from ordinary people on the internet and in the real world saying bollocks to all of this. And that's what started to push things in a new direction. And that's why I find it a very exciting development.
So to break up the three parts of this subtitle, the revolt against wokeness in particular, you'll have noticed that there's been a big discussion over the past couple of years about whether or not wokeness is dead. Yes, no, in between. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the death of wokeness has been greatly exaggerated. It's still out there. It is still in the institutions. I'm not saying that to make everyone feel depressed, because as I just said, things are changing, things are moving, people are rebelling, but it is still out there. We can't deny that. It's still, you know, kids at schools are still being taught that British history is just one crime after another, which has led to a situation where 42% of people under the age of 25 would fight for this country if we were invaded by a foreign army. So we're screwed, basically, if we're ever invaded. There are still, you can still go to a university campus and be booed and hissed if you say that men are not women. You still see, if you look at the Berlinale Film Festival, which is currently being consumed by the hysteria over Gaza, by Israelophobia, just this kind of incredibly destructive Maoist determination to force everyone to bend the knee, to correct think on Israel, correct think on Gaza. These people are so infected by hatred for the Jewish state that they will even destroy their own artistic institutions on the altar of that ideological belief. So it's still out there. Wokeness, it just takes a different form to what it used to take. It's a bit of a shape shifting phenomenon, kind of attaches itself to different ideas, but it's still there. So no, wokeness is not dead. But what's exciting about the period we live in is that dissent is alive. Dissent, you can feel it in the air. My WhatsApp groups with people I know are constantly buzzing with dissenting ideas. They're constantly buzzing with just this stream of abuse about Keir Starmer and all these other people, and saying, people are excited about Reform UK and the possibility there'll be a new party in power, and all these, they feel like the world is being turned upside down in a way that they really like. And so we have two things going on at the same time right now. Firstly, the institutions are still beholden to the woke ideology, but at the same time, ordinary people are distancing themselves from that ideology more and more. And that fractious tension, I think, is incredibly interesting and very fruitful as well.
Should we talk about Trump briefly? Because that's in some ways the starting point for your book, him being re-elected from exile. It felt like a really huge cultural moment, not just for America, but for the rest of the world. It also had a big impact on a lot of the issues you've already been talking about, him signing this flurry of executive orders on men and women's sports and critical race theory and so on and so forth. Do you think that was really important for not just America, but for the world? Because it seemed like so much woke culture, so many woke ideas, even if they didn't originate in America, it was through kind of American cultural imperialism almost that it was pumped out to the rest of us. So was that a really key moment, not just for America, but for the rest of us, I suppose?
Yeah, very key moment. I don't know how many people have read Trump's executive orders, that flurry of executive orders he did after he was inaugurated in January last year. You should read them. I mean, they're really, really good. I know Trump didn't write them. His minions in the White House wrote them, but they are superb, especially the one on history, rescuing American history from these museums and institutions that are continually denigrating American history. And the one on men and women's sports talks about how brutal and unfair and corrupt it is to allow blokes to play sports against women. And the one on environmentalism, which basically says, for too long we've been suffocated by this green tape. We have this abundance of natural resources in America, and we're going to dig them up and exploit them and use them for the benefit of working class communities. I mean, Spike could have written these executive orders. I'm hoping someone in the White House was reading Spike before they put pen to paper. They are really good, I think, and they are incredibly important globally as well as in terms of America. One of the points I make in my book is that I actually think it's a kind of two-way relationship, because I'm not sure those executive orders would exist unless ordinary people had started pushing back against these ideas. I think that's particularly true in relation to the trans executive orders, because I really believe that TERF Island, as Britain is often referred to, is the birthplace of this radical idea that biology is real. I don't know if you've heard this really dangerous idea that biology exists. And I think that in turn influenced America, influenced Trump, influenced the White House, essentially. And then one of the other chapters in my book, which I'm sure we'll come on to, is about environmentalism. Let's call it what it is, climate change lunacy, because we all like the environment. We all want clean air and nice trees, etc. But climate change lunacy, Trump's executive order on that is really good as well, but I'm not sure that that shift would have occurred without the Gilets jaunes in France, who rose up against eco-taxes in 2019 on the streets every weekend for 2 years, or the farmers across Europe who've been revolting against stringent eco measures for years and years now. These massive revolts of ordinary working people, which don't get nearly enough media coverage. But all of those, I think, were the real shifters off the vibe. And then that kind of gets imbibed by the ruling classes in different ways. Some of them kind of bristle at it and think you've gone too far. Others, I think, like Trump, felt a greater freedom then to express their own climate change skepticism. So yeah, I think those executive orders were really important in terms of the global impact they made. But I also think the impact that global people made on Trump is kind of the origin of some of those ideas.
And so to move on to environmentalism and greenism, we've been writing about this, you've been writing about this for a very long time, the way in which there was such a chasm between an elite who were obsessed with this issue and ordinary people who were on the receiving end of all of these green policies, not particularly moved by the idea that the world is ending. Why now then? Why do you think that over the course of the past 5 years, or a little bit more than that if we're talking about the Gilets jaunes, there has been this much more assertive street protests, the yellow vest, the farmers, what have you? What is it that's really brought that issue to the fore? Because it seemed like amongst the various unsayable things in your book, even daring to suggest that maybe people and their living standards should go ahead of the highfalutin schemes of Ed Miliband or Joe Biden or whatever, that was a pretty difficult thing to push back against. Why is it burst out into the open now rather than over the course of the past decade or whatever?
Yeah, good question. You know, one of the most bullshit of ideas of our time is that the world is coming to an end. I can't believe so many people fell for this. Like really well-educated people would be on the street saying that 3 billion people will die before 2035 if you don't stop driving to Tesco. I mean, this is literally what they were saying. Complete and utter, this is kind of Charles Manson levels, helter-skelter levels of idiocy. And yet people were on the street saying that for years. There is nothing in the IPCC reports to stack that up. The IPCC reports has nothing about an apocalyptic outcome as a consequence of the changing climate. It's just a complete invention. These people just made it up. You got, what's that bloke? Your man from Extinction Rebellion with a beard.
Roger Hallam.
Roger Hallam is saying that billions of people will die and you'll all get raped in your living rooms. You think, hold on, how do we get from a bit of pollution to these kind of completely ridiculous scenarios? It was insane. I think one of the things I try to draw out in my book is that I do think future historians will look back on the period in which we are living and they will think, what the hell was wrong with those people? What were they playing at with all their stupid ideas? But I think the reason why I think there are two pressures on the climate change alarmism. The first was just the objective changes taking place in the world. So in the 2010s, which even though the crash had happened and things were getting a bit hairy, it was pretty stable. Things weren't shifting that dramatically economically yet. Things were you could kind of muddle through. But in the 2020s, in the late 2010s and the 2020s, things really started to get difficult for people economically. Energy bills were spiking. There was war in Europe. We realized we couldn't rely on Russia, certainly not China, for energy in the way that we might have done in the past. Things just came to a head. And it really forced nation states and the people who live in nation states to ask themselves, how do we produce energy? Why aren't we digging for coal? Why aren't we drilling for oil in the North Sea? Why aren't we becoming more energy dependent? So that objective circumstances force those questions to the surface. But more importantly, there was just this subjective rebellion. Ordinary people said, we've had enough of this. And one of the things I say in that chapter in my book is that it was on the same day, I think it was 17th of November 2019. I might be completely making that up, I've forgotten now. But Extinction Rebellion launched in London on the exact same day that the Gilets jaunes launched in Paris. And the difference between these two groups is extraordinary. So you had 6,000 posh twats in London. They blocked these are the plummiest people you will ever meet. They blocked 5 bridges. They were dancing in the streets, saying billions will die, singing like medieval hysterics. These kind of incredibly well-educated, privileged people saying the world is ending. And then in Paris and across France, you had around 250,000 people, working class people and lower middle class people, taking to the streets to say, we've had enough of climate change hysteria. We want better wages. We want to drive without having to pay a tax. We want to live more freely. We want to live more fruitfully. And that is the original war of the vibe shift right there on that day. where you have the kind of blue blood aristocrats in London saying the Industrial Revolution is the worst thing that ever happened and we all want to go back to our country piles, up in, our Downton Abbey style mansions that we used to live in, and you serfs were working on the land. They want to go back to that. Whereas in Paris and across France, working class people were saying, we want to have a greater share of French industry. We want we want better pay. We don't want to have to pay so much to drive, to live, to eat. And if you had told me back then that the Gilets Jaunes their ideas would have come to the fore more than the Extinction Rebellion's ideas, I would have struggled to believe you. And their great rallying cry was, they said to the elites in Paris, you worry about the end of the world, we worry about the end of the month. And that, I think, was one of the most important rallying cries of our time. And that's the idea that's won through. And that is essentially what one of Trump's executive orders says, which is that we need to focus more on people's wages and living conditions rather than talking about some climate apocalypse that's never going to happen. So, objective conditions and subjective pissed offness, I think, is the thing that dislodged that ideology.
I'd almost forgotten about Extinction Rebellion. And their names, does anyone remember? They were always
Poppy.
they'd get very upset that people would call them posh, and then you'd find out they were called Indigo Rumbelow, Edred Whittingham, and Eben Lazarus. I don't know why I remember these, but it's very memorable. On the question of environmentalism then, because you're right, it has been pushed back. I mean, the way in which you've got governments, not even necessarily right of centre governments, just admitting that the jig is up effectively, and actually cheap and reliable energy is pretty important if you want to have some level of prosperity. But at the same time, it does seem like it's, as with all of the things that we're talking about, the pushback has also created its own kind of backlash from the other side. We have Zach Polanski, the Green Movement's favourite hypnotist, leading this supposedly left populist party in this country, making a lot of waves. I mean, what do you make of him as a figure? And does that suggest that, as with all of these issues, any pushback from ordinary people is always going to engender its own kind of backlash from the environmentalist set?
Yeah, hypno tits, as people lovingly call him. I mean, he's obviously completely mad. That's the first thing to say about Zach Polanski. But the second thing to say about him is he doesn't actually talk about the environment very much. That's what's really interesting. He talks about Gaza. Oh, God, anyway. He talks about Gaza, of course, because you have to if you come from that section of society. It's the way you prove that you are a morally good person. What else does he talk about?
He likes trans, doesn't he?
Trans. He talks about, he wants more.
He was very worried that Graham Linehan would inspire people to punch women in the balls.
Yeah. He doesn't want you to. He doesn't want Zach Polanski. Definitely doesn't.
If he's worried about that, he shouldn't be worried.
It's
physically impossible to do something.
Don't punch women in the balls. Yeah. That's a really important lesson that Zach Polanski wants us to take on board. He wants more trans people. He wants more immigrants to wipe his bum, as he said on Question Time, and he wants less of a Jewish homeland. I mean, those are his three policies. But he doesn't actually talk about environmentalism very much, because you're not going to win votes in the left behind parts of Britain if you go up there and say, don't you think you should recycle more and stop driving your car and stop buying cheap products? You're not going to win votes like that. And I think he's clocked that. But there could, people refer to the ordinary people's rebellion against climate change and alarmism. My favorite rebellion, in fact, was in Poland, when construction workers marched through the streets because some of their construction projects had been closed down under pressure of environmental demands. And they marched through the streets chanting, "Fuck the Green Deal." And the lack of coverage of this stuff I find so horrifying. It's like in France, the Netherlands, Germany, there was a siege of Berlin by thousands and thousands of farmers. And then construction workers rising up in Poland, and even as far as Canada, farmers have been revolting against eco rules. And there's just no coverage because it is inconvenient to the elites to cover these facts. But yes, people refer to that as a green lash. They say there is a green lash coming from working class communities. And I think there could well be a backlash against the green lash, where the kind of establishment reasserts its ideological conviction that the world is coming to an end. That could well happen. But at the moment, they're on the back foot. And I think out of all the issues I cover in my book, that's probably the issue on which they're most on the back foot, because climate change alarmism is the ultimate luxury belief. You have to be the most privileged, ensconced, cosseted twat to be able to spend your every waking hour talking about end times, talking about an apocalypse, and an apocalypse that's going to come about because of industry or manufacturing, work, transport, all these wonderful developments of modernity, and you see them only as a threat to your incredibly comfortable way of life in the country. It's the ultimate luxury belief. So reasserting that in a time in which luxury beliefs, I think, are on the back foot is going to be very difficult, and that's good.
Should we talk about flags? So in the kind of penultimate chapter of the book, you talk about Operation Raise the Colours, this campaign that we saw kick off last summer in the UK of people putting up Union flags and crosses St George on lampposts across the country, and obviously sparked this huge panic amongst various sections of the commentariat who like to get panicked about the idea that racism was roaring back, that this was basically an attempt of people to intimidate ethnic minorities, that there was nothing else to it. Of course, that the hotel protests were going on at the same time. So there's been a lot of speaking for these people, and there's been a lot of interpreting them in the worst possible way. But what do you think that movement in particular, the hoisting of the flag, represents? What do you think it's getting at? What do you think they're saying when they do this?
I thought it was wonderful. I was so happy every time I saw an England flag or a Union flag in that summer of 2025. I found it so thrilling, really. And I say that as someone, I grew up in a household, an Irish household in northwest London, where we were not allowed to have these flags. Britpop was a nightmare for me and my brothers, because we couldn't even wear an Oasis t-shirt with a Union flag on it, because my dad would say, "Get out of here with that evil flag." So I don't come from a natural, we called it the butcher's apron. That's what Irish people call the Union flag. So I don't come from a natural flag waving, Queen saluting family. But I found over the past few years, especially since Brexit, after Brexit, I would have waved the flag of this country until the end of times. I loved it so much. But the Operation Raise the Colours last year was really an attempt by ordinary working class communities to stake a claim over the country in which they live, to say this is our country, and actually it's an important place. It's not, this is a nation. It's not just a massive hotel for every man from overseas who wants to come here. It's not just a landing strip for the super rich who can come here and exploit communities and then bugger off again. It's not this kind of transient entity where people can just come and go as they please. It's a real place with a real history and a real culture and a real flag. And it was ordinary people waving the flag. And it was such a relief, because the only two flags we've seen really over the past 10 years is the Pride flag and the Palestine flag. I mean, for God's sake, every arts institution has these flags. There was a time when if you went down Regent Street during Pride Month, it was like we'd been invaded by a foreign army. There was just these huge, massive flags festooned across Regent Street. Pride flags, of course, the trans flag, even worse. And those were the only flags that you were allowed to wave, because they were flags that would signal your virtue, that would show that you were one of the good people. Those flags were a form of moral distinction. It was really a way for the upper classes to distinguish themselves from the rabble by saying, look, we care about Palestine, unlike you people. We care about trans people and gay people, unlike you people. Those flags were it was an incredibly elitist endeavor to wave those flags. And what Operation Raise the Colours represented was a working class revolt against that. And it was a unifying flag, because the only thing that the UK flag or the St George's flag says is, this is England. This is the United Kingdom, and we are all part of it. It was an attempt by ordinary people to reassert a sense of collective solidarity against the isolating, atomizing trends of neoliberalism, virtue signaling, woke ideology. So when we look at the revolts that have taken place over the past few years, I think the flag waving one is an incredibly important one, and just such a moving defense of nationhood after years of globalist lunacy. So a really positive development.
And just as you were speaking, I was thinking that some of the other movements that we're talking about always came wrapped in the flag as well. The Gilets jaunes always, wrapped in the French tricolour. If you, the Dutch farmers would have the Dutch flag. Even the Canadian truckers, you would have flags everywhere. I mean, what is it about nation that seems to be people are really latching onto now in a big way? It seems to be almost the image of every protest that we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's really true. And if you go to the Iranian protests that we've had in London over the past few weeks, they will wave the flag of Iran, not the Islamic Republic, the flag of Iran. And you will see, obviously, also the Union flag, the British flag, and you will see the Israel flag. So you do see these national flags coming into play in these movements. I think it's a lot of people recognize that one of the worst things the elites have done over the past few years has been to dismantle nations. It's such a destructive policy on so many different levels. We live in an era in which it's very fashionable to be post borders, to say, what they call doctors without borders, or lawyers without borders, or everyone is without borders these days. And we're supposed to just throw open our borders to anyone who wants to come here and just say, come in, do what you want. That's fine. We don't care. Crack on. And I think people just reached a breaking point with that. And, the protests you mentioned outside migrant hotels, where you have many working class women and working class men gathering to say, look, we don't know who's in these hotels. We don't know where they're from. We don't know what they're up to. So maybe they should bugger off. People said that was racist. It wasn't racist at all. It was sovereigntist. These were people defending the sovereignty of the nation, which the elites flat out fail to do. They don't protect our borders. They don't check who's coming here. They don't say, you're allowed in, but you're not. They don't do any of that anymore. And I think people just clocked that this withering of nationhood was an assault on them and their communities and their democratic rights. Because if you don't have a nation, then you don't have democracy. If you don't have coherent, well-policed borders, then you don't have a territory that is your own, that belongs to you and your community, and in which you can exercise some genuine democratic power. So I think the flag waving that we've seen on all these sorts of protests is really a brilliant, stirring revolt against globalism and the destructive consequences that it's had.
And I think two of the through lines of your book, one of which is class, which I think we talked about a fair amount, but the other one which we've talked about less is censorship. It seems that in every case, when people are standing up to gender ideology, or they're standing up to out of control environmentalism, or people who want to demonize voters because they vote for Brexit or because they want more sovereignty, what have you, there's always been this censorship, whether it's soft censorship, hard censorship. Why was that so central, do you think, to all of these elite projects? Why was that something that people really had to overcome if they wanted to make the kinds of arguments for, common sense and for nationhood and for biological reality? Why was censorship so important to the elites, and continues to be, I guess?
Yeah, none of these ideologies would have survived 5 minutes without censorship, because they were so thin and substanceless and pointless. The only way in which they could be defended was through this vast infrastructure of censorship. And you're absolutely right. On all of those issues, censorship was absolutely key. So, think about the word phobia. I'm guilty of using it. Well, I say Israelophobia all day long, because it's funny and it winds people up. But
it's also a very useful way of calling people anti-Semitic without getting a legal letter. So it's a good get around.
Whenever I call someone Israelophobic in an article, you know what I'm really saying. So, but I can't say it. But think about the use of the word phobia. So if you were a gender critical feminist or just an ordinary woman who pushed back against that ideology, you were called transphobic. If you raised questions about Islamist terrorism or radical Islam and the threat that it poses to community life and actual life in this country, you were called Islamophobic. If you voted for Brexit or you questioned the porousness of our borders. You were called xenophobic. They had this entire grammar of censorship and demonization that was aimed at isolating people who raised questions, making an example of them in order to have a chilling effect across society, to say to all of us, don't express these ideas because you could get in trouble. And people did get in trouble. People were cancelled. People lost their jobs. Lots of women lost their jobs for criticizing transgenderism. People were banned from speaking at universities. There were real world consequences for pushing back against these ideologies. And so whenever an ideology is enforced and policed by censorship, you know that there's something wrong with it. You know there's something wrong with it. And one of the points I make in my book is that the entire vibe shift on every level, both in relation to wokeness, in relation to climate change alarmism, in relation to the border question, the whole vibe shift is basically ordinary people defying censorship and saying the things you're not meant to say. So there's a pretty long section in the book about Mumsnet. I'm sure you're familiar with Mumsnet, an online forum for new mums saying, you know, my kid won't go to sleep, what can I do? But over the past 10 or 15 years, it became this hotbed of really rebellious commentary on trans, where women not only were sharing tips on how to raise their kids, but were also saying, what's this bollocks about trans women? And that was a kind of this simmering dissent on the internet. And one of the points I make in my book is that the most striking thing about Mumsnet, the most important thing about it, is that it managed to withstand the pressure on social media to censor yourself. So if you think back in that period on Twitter, Facebook, even Reddit, there were certain things you weren't allowed to say about the trans issue. And that really chilled the discussion. But Mumsnet, for some reason, just managed to keep flying the flag, just holding the candle for biological truth and reality, etc. And it's from Mumsnet that a lot of those kinds of trans skeptical ideas then blew up into the real world. And in fact, that prim woke feminist from America I talked about, she was most horrified because she kept seeing middle-aged women with badges that said radicalized by Mumsnet. And she was like, what the hell is going on Mumsnet? So it's just a classic example of the most important tool for pushing back against social authoritarianism or elite hysteria is freedom of speech, saying the unsayable, rejecting censorship. That is the absolute starting point. I mean, George Bernard Shaw made this point years ago. He said, obviously years ago, he said that censorship exists to protect institutions from criticism. And therefore, the first step to progress, the first step to transformation, the first step to improve in society is to remove censorship. And that has been the most important thing in the vibe shift.
So I'm just going to ask one more question before we go out for contributions and questions from the audience. To go back to woke for a second, I know you said earlier that you didn't want to depress people by suggesting that it's not dead and actually we've got a fair way to go. If I might depress people even more, is it a chance it's actually gotten much, much worse? And the reason I say that is because you're absolutely right, and it's all there in the book. It has been challenged in so many different areas. So it's been challenged in the courts over here with the gender ruling in the Supreme Court. There's been a political backlash to it. I don't think there's going to be any party, certainly a right of centre party, that is not going to run on a kind of explicitly anti-woke ticket anytime soon. And it has been kind of knocked off its perch to a certain degree in a lot of those places. But if you look at woke protest movements, student politics, what have you, if you look at the murder of Charlie Kirk and the way in which that was greeted with this kind of giggling nihilism across social media, if you look at the Palestine movement, quote unquote, which seems to have embraced Islamist barbarism effectively. So they've gone from trying to cancel you to trying to kill you. And they've gone from celebrating a man winning the women's 100 meters or whatever to celebrating the murder of Jews in Israel. Like, this seems to have morphed in some respects into something even more sort of depraved in some respects. Do you think maybe that woke isn't dead, it's just taken on a new form in that respect?
Oh yeah, we have no space for complacency at all. That's really important. And in fact, the last book I did with Spike was called After the Pogrom, and it was about basically saying the West has gone mental. So I recognize that these two things are happening in tandem. Whereas there is this kind of after the pogrom, I refer to it as the lure of barbarism, where younger generations in particular, especially the well-educated, because universities actually screw your mind up rather than educating you these days. Young people, the well-educated, privileged sections of society were sucked into this barbaric vortex where they found themselves on the side of Hamas. Fascism returned. We saw the worst mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust, and people took the side of the fascists. I mean, in their millions across the Western world, we saw it with our own eyes. So we absolutely should not be complacent. And I think the urges behind wokeness, which is this kind of elite hysteria, this extraordinary need to signal your virtue, and I mean that in the kind of really crazy way, not just wearing a badge or wearing the keffiyeh or whatever, but that instinct to lord it over society, to say, I am so much better than you. All of those trends are still there, and they simply take a different form. So if, for example, the trans ideology were to disappear tomorrow, I don't think it will, it's still out there, that urge would find another outlet. It would move on to something else. And I think that's the role that the Gaza question has played. And that's one of the reasons I call them Gazaholics, people who are so dementedly obsessed with this issue. And really, they just hate the Jewish nation and want to destroy it because they're racist bigots. Let's boil it down, that's what we're talking about. But the reason that's become such a furious focus for their moral energies is because all the other stuff is falling down. All the other stuff is being called into question. Look at Greta Thunberg. God bless her. She went from raging against a climate apocalypse that never happened to screaming her head off about a genocide that never happened. I mean, that is the terrifying nothingness of luxury activism summed up, where these people devote their lives to issues that actually don't exist. There is no eco-apocalypse. There is no genocide in Gaza. They're making it up in order to furnish themselves with some sense of purpose in life. But her journey from saying, how dare you about the Industrial Revolution, essentially, to then saying, how dare you because the Jews dare to stand up for themselves. That journey actually captures what's happened with wokeness in general, which is that it's shifted from one thing to another. And just as they once said that industrious mankind would cause the end of life as we know it, now they're saying Israel will cause the end of life as we know it. It's this search for the omnicause. So that instinct won't go away. And in fact, in some ways, it could get worse, as you're saying, because as all the other things fall apart, they will just focus intensely on something else. So yeah, no room for complacency. But we should crack a few champagne corks over the fact that, if someone were to stand up in a room these days and say in a deep voice, I'm a woman, everyone would laugh at them, right? That's a good, positive development. That actually happened to me at the University of York. Someone in the audience stood up and said, Brendan, do you recognize that I'm a woman? And he had like stubble and a dress. I said, no, I don't. And those kinds of developments are they're actually really positive. They're really positive. So we should guard against the movement of this hysterical impetus to other issues, but we should celebrate the gains when we get them. And I think there have been quite a few over the past few years. Thanks again to PIA VPN for sponsoring this episode. Take control of your digital life and get PIA for 86% off. Click the link in the description below or scan the QR code.